You've had all these experiences in life. And yet, there's one part of you that was there the whole time. That same essence, your same awareness, your same consciousness has been with you this whole time. And it's with you now. We're still struggling, stumbling. Some people are dying in the process. Some people are sick unnecessarily. But eventually, we've got to get there. And we can change the paradigm. We can do it.
Stress. It's a word we hear every day. People are stressed out, work is stressful, but what do we really know about stress? Before we can figure that out, let's take a quick travel back in time starting around 70,000 BC. Hunter-gatherers had to be on high alert in order to survive from other predators in their environment. Even though this seems like an extremely long time ago, we actually react to stress in the environment just like these early people. Let's fast forward to early in the 17th century to see French philosopher René Descartes, who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He is also responsible for the idea of mind-body dualism, which some call the mind-body problem. He theorized that if the mind was a thinking thing and the body was a non-thinking thing, that the mind could exist without the body, but the body could not exist without the mind, which essentially declared them as separate. This paved the way for many schools of thought addressing this mind-body split. Several decades later, we hear the word stress used by English natural philosopher Robert Hooke in engineering terms. He was interested in how man-made structures, such as bridges, could be made to withstand heavy loads without collapsing. He created what he called the law of elasticity, which demonstrated how something like a spring could withstand a certain amount of stress before it reached a breaking point. This machine-like analogy proved to be fertile ground for future explanations of how humans experience stress. His rival at the time, Sir Isaac Newton, would soon introduce his 3 laws of motion, which would continue to point toward a mechanistic view of the body. He also held a grudge against Robert Hooke and is responsible for why you've probably never heard of him. And now, to jump ahead to the mid-1800s. French physician Claude Bernard introduced the idea that the internal environment of living organisms must remain fairly constant in response to changes in the external environment. Based on this work, in the early 1900s, American physiologist Walter Bradford Cannon coined the term homeostasis to describe this neutral, stable state that needed to exist for the body to survive. He also coined the term fight or flight, but we'll get back to that later. When it comes to our current understanding of stress, the man responsible is Hungarian-Canadian endocrinologist Hans Selye. He is known for his work studying what he called general adaptation syndrome. He would later coin the term stress, which is still used to explain aspects of the stress response. This response is directly responsible for helping the body to return to homeostasis, which brings us to today.
Most people, when they think of stress, they think it's like they're stressed out in their mind. They're worrying about things. They're obsessing about things. The response part of the stress response is your body's response to that stress. So most of us walking around, we don't put 2 and 2 together.
When a layperson hears something like stress response, they know that they think that stress is the cause of their problem, but we teach them that stress is actually an aggravating factor of whatever existing weakness they have, because we're all stressed all the time. One of the things we want to take a look at is that people have physical stress, biochemical nutritional stress, and mental emotional stress. People think when they think of stress, it's whatever they're stressed out about at their job or their career or their family or whatever's going on in their life personally. But stress takes many different forms. So our goal is to make sure that they know is that all of these things are equally important. Your mind and your body are the same thing. It's not some new agey kind of statement. If you alter your mind, it's going to alter your body.
A person who has a heart attack today, were they healthy yesterday? Of course not. Were they healthy last week or last month? Most likely not. But there was something that was going on that led to that crisis, that heart attack. The emotions work the same way. They accumulate, and then something goes wrong.
When somebody's under a lot of stress, at least emotional stress, a whole cascade of things can be going on, from neck problems to low back problems to stomach problems to anxiety to I've seen people go through cyclical infections to you name it. Stress causes almost every condition out there. And if we can just take some of that emotional pressure off their system, at least the chemistry of that emotion, their body has a better chance to heal.
Where I find stress is a really big deal for a lot of people are their own internal thoughts. They beat themselves up. They don't think they're good enough. They feel like they have to be perfect. And every time they fail at something, they stress themselves out. And those are the stressors which oftentimes people don't think they're stressed about. But so ask yourself this: if every time you do something wrong, do you beat yourself up? If you do that, you're stressing yourself out. So what we try and do is we help people recognize those things so that they can deal with them a little bit more effectively so that they don't actually stress themselves out internally.
The autonomic nervous system is a sciencey way of talking about the part of the nervous system that isn't the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain and the nerves that connect down. The autonomic nervous system has two major branches, so to speak. Sympathetic, which we call fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which we could call relaxation and restoration. When we're in that latter mode, the relaxation, restoration mode of our nervous system, that's when healing occurs, that's when the body rejuvenates itself. When we're in the fight or flight mode, we're actually getting ready to ward off something threatening. So we need that, but we can't be in it all the time or it has negative health effects.
You might be driving in traffic and someone cuts in front of you, your life's not in danger, but your body gives the same response. And that ties back into the stress response. Because when you go into that fight or flight state of being, your parasympathetic calming nervous system is turned off. That also turns off all your healing and resting and digesting portion of your body.
So it's kind of like, if you have a Ferrari and you're going 140 miles per hour, I mean, that's what it's built for. But if it goes 140 miles per hour all day long, 24/7, and you never stop and you never get a chance for it to be garaged and parked for it to rest, that can be damaging to the car. So that's much like our body as well. If it's constantly in fight or flight and in stress mode all the time, then it can lead to early breakdown.
We need to remember that stress is not up here, right? It's whole body. And that stress is a physiological phenomenon, right? And I often will use with patients the example of, okay, stress is a physiological phenomenon that is not necessarily in your control, right? It's not about the rational response. So it's kind of like when you're driving down the road, and you're going, okay, I look at my speedometer, my rational brain is in front of me, and it says, okay, I'm going 55. And then all of a sudden you see sirens in your rearview mirror. And what happens? And patients always know, they say, oh, well, yeah, I grip the steering wheel, my heart starts to pound, sometimes I sweat, my tummy gets butterflies. And with that, it's like, exactly. That is the physiology of stress, because your rational brain looks at your speedometer and says, oh, I'm going 55, but you still see those sirens and think, oh, I'm in trouble, it's a threat. And it's a perceived threat. It's not necessarily real. It's the emotional reality. And then the police car goes right by you. You go, okay, whew. But you still feel the physiological effects of stress.
Sometimes things happen early in life where we are in a dangerous situation or something is perceived to be awful happening, and the body is unable to extinguish that response on an unconscious level. Years later, we find out that buried stress, those buried feelings that have never gone away, are still being triggered in any situation that looks the same, sounds the same, smells the same, feels the same, can trigger that on an unconscious level and bring the feelings back, even though it's a different situation.
So there was a 50% increase in the neuron density between the amygdala and the frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is the front part of the brain, and that's responsible for long-term planning, thinking, complex reasoning. That's the part of the brain that says, everything's going to be okay. I shouldn't be stressed about this. This is nothing to worry about. And my clients and the participants in the study will say all the time, I say all the right things to myself, but it just doesn't matter. And that's exactly true, because the message isn't getting through to the emotional brain.
And we also know from this study that every time a really distressing event gets reactivated or there's a reminder of it, that your nervous system reacts. So when we looked at the biofeedback, we know that the autonomic nervous system gets involved. And when the autonomic nervous system gets hyperactivated, that has a negative effect on health outcomes, quality of life across the board, creates too much inflammation in the system, and so.
Upon further analysis of the data, the team at Jefferson noticed some very interesting changes regarding the cerebellum. This led to the publishing of their second paper in 2017.
It's kind of traditionally been taught that the cerebellum is primarily involved in the coordination of our motor activity. So when it comes to emotions, it's not that relevant. It's not really helping us with anything. It's really just helping us to move our hands and to move our legs and to do that in a coordinated fashion. But a growing number of research studies, as we came to find, and as we started to look at it, we started to see, well, gee, there's some interesting studies that show that when the cerebellum is activated, that has something to do with the laying down of traumatic memories.
According to a scientific paper published in 2015 titled The Emotional Cerebellum, imaging experts revealed the cerebellum is activated during mental recall of emotional personal episodes and during the learning of a conditioned or unconditioned association involving emotions.
Even though the cerebellum is relatively small, it's just kind of these little balls in the back of the brain. It has 5 times the number of neurons as the rest of the brain combined. And then we started to realize, well, this is all starting to make some sense. If this part of the brain normally is involved in the coordination of motor function, maybe it's also involved in the coordination of emotional function. And if that's the case, then perhaps what we're seeing is that as a result of going through the neuro-emotional technique and the various elements that are involved in it, that we are having a direct impact on how that cerebellum is able to regulate the emotional, help in the regulation of these emotional centers of the brain.
This is one of the reasons to get up and go to work as a medical researcher, because you don't get to see these kinds of results every day.
But it also opens up the door even more in terms of the field of cognitive neuroscience and emotions and psychiatry and psychology, because it helps us to understand that the cerebellum may be a very critical area of our brain that is very much related to our emotional selves, and not just how our body moves, but how our body is moved emotionally.
So much of our cultural narrative revolves around the stresses of life, and it can make us feel powerless. Struggles with anxiety, depression, and chronic health problems are becoming more and more common. Every one of us has been through traumatic events in our life, and it's something that should bring us together more instead of disconnecting us. The mind and the body are intimately connected, and the more we can embrace that, the more we can take control of our health and ultimately take control of our lives.